from Washington, D.C., and good evening to our friends in Singapore, Parag and Ayesha, Khanna. And of course, I'm joined here in Washington, D.C., and of course, separate places virtually with our CEO and founder, Jim Moore. Jim, I'll leave it to you for a second while I do my thing, and of course, I'll be returning this right back.
That sounds great. Hello, good evening to both Ayesha and to Parag. It's great to see you. It's been since last fall since we saw one another in Singapore.
That's right.
Anyway, and a lot has changed in that short period of time. There is so much that has transpired. It's really extraordinary, and I think we're all in the middle of the battle right now, trying to figure out what the future is going to look like. It's just it's amazing stuff. Everything from the coronavirus to the what's happened to the global economy as a consequence, and then obviously civil unrest, which began here in the United States, but also seems to have spread worldwide. So where all this goes, it's anybody's guess.
It's going to be a long road to figure out the answer, and it's
sure
not
will.
going to be. It'll be a different answer in every place, probably.
You bet. You bet. We're having a real serious spike back here in regards to the coronavirus, and of course, when you're dealing with 50 states. And the way the federal government has decided to handle all this is let each one of the governors in all 50 states and territories like the District of Columbia decide exactly how they're going to handle all this. I have one friend, for example, who is on the border between Pennsylvania and Ohio, and his hair kept getting longer and longer and longer, and he wasn't, of course, allowed to be able to go to the barber. So what did he do? He found out Ohio was opening up their barber shops earlier, so he simply went 10 miles away into Ohio, able to get his hair cut. He was so delighted and relieved, and then he returned to Pennsylvania. Well, what kind of protection is that?
Yeah,
if you have all these different, anyway, we shall see.
Well, I wanted to start the conversation with turning into, of course, Singapore, where, of course, Ayesha and Parag, you just had your elections, last Friday. Of course, it's been an interesting process, some changes, of course, coming up. But, as you know, we don't get into too much politics, but I do want to turn to Singapore for a second and just talk about some of the lessons learned, especially during this coronavirus pandemic, which the global, economic downturn, of course, and all the challenges that we're facing. Just wanted to hear from both of you your views on some of the lessons learned, especially with the coronavirus pandemic, some of the things that have happened in Singapore, and what are some of the lessons that, again, the globe can take from what Singapore has been doing?
Well, I think one of the things that Singapore has done really well is constantly communicate and be very transparent with all the measures that are being taken, all the statistics of whoever has been COVID positive, has recovered, what areas they're in. You can just go to the Singapore government dashboard and find out everything. The second thing, and I think this is natural because it's a city state, is that the entire government is one team. And they all are there's a coherent strategy. And Prime Minister Lee speaks and addresses the nation every couple of weeks. And actually, after hearing him, everybody feels a lot calmer and better. Again, he's very honest. He's not promising a rose garden, but he's also has a number, and his team have a number of action items in place to tackle things. And I think that has been very reassuring. The third thing that I would say is just a civil society, because I think we are small. It's a civil society that, we kind of look out for each other. And once the government tells us that this is the best way to protect each other and ourselves, you see there's a reasonable amount of compliance as well. So I think that has helped the social distancing in place. The government has been very systematic, and all the businesses have made sure that social distancing is there, and the schools are very particular. And so I think these kind of things where operationally it's being handled well and it's being communicated well to the public, that's something that I think has really helped as well.
We'll get into that.
Let me just add a couple of points. When you talk about lessons learned, Hakan, probably one of the biggest advantages that Asian countries had in coping with coronavirus is the lesson from the SARS epidemic of 17 years ago, because there is an institutional memory and a social memory, a societal memory of that experience, whether it's in China or Southeast Asian countries, certainly here in Singapore. So there's an immediate recognition of the seriousness of it, no joking, no bantering and bickering, on Fox News or anything like that. It was, okay, this could be SARS, it could be worse. Either way, everyone remembers what we had to do then, what we've got to do now. The second that kind of dovetails with Ayesha's point is, and I really like this phrase, authority without authoritarianism. And the point is that there is a respect for authority. They're not kidding around. There's any number of medical doctors who are in the parliament. There is a respect for state capacity, independent bureaucracy. They know what they're doing. They don't want to unnecessarily interfere in people's lives. They would prefer that everyone just go out their business, but they know that certain measures have to be taken. They say, look, folks, this is what we got to do. And people say, okay, fine. If this trusted authority said so, let's just do it. Let's put on our masks and let's, use the Trace Together app, which actually was not used as much as it could have been or should have been. But certainly that app has been a role model for other places. So I think more broadly, this issue of state capacity in the last few weeks, I know that in the US media and elsewhere, people have started to wake up to the fact that, being a democracy is great, but you're not anything without state capacity. You're literally not a state without capacity, right? And we're seeing that the right balance of types of government that have come together and done well, like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, they're full-fledged, world-class, grade A democracies, but they have the world's best civil services as well that have the capacity to go out and solve problems.
Interesting.
It's interesting, but many years ago, I was representing the United States in Punta del Este, Uruguay. And after this was in establishing the World Trade Organization, and it was the latest round of international trade negotiations. And after a very long day of negotiations, I went into a small restaurant. I hadn't had a thing to eat all day long. And I saw this fellow sitting off to the side, and realizing he was all by himself, I walked up to him and introduced myself. And he introduced himself, and we spent the next 5 hours talking to one another into the night. And that representative from Singapore is the current Prime Minister of Singapore. And it was incredible. And I came to appreciate how thoughtful he was. I had been an extraordinary devotee of his father, who won the incredibly distinguished honor in being able to address a joint session of Congress. But his approach to the way he built Singapore after it left the custody of the United Kingdom was rather extraordinary. And I think, to what you both were just mentioning, within this period of the coronavirus, in which everybody has had to learn from scratch, there's been really, notwithstanding SARS and a couple of those incidents, there's really been nothing quite like this. And I think for an awful lot of people here in the United States, it's humbled them to understand that we do not here in the United States hold a corner on the market to understanding how to be able to deal with some of these things. And that we can learn from Singapore and South Korea and Taiwan and Japan. I mean, it's incredible.
No, it's a great point, Jim. Before we kind of switch to other topics as well, Ayesha, I do want to get your view though on artificial intelligence, of course, the role of AI in not only, of course, economic challenges and how we overcome them, but also in the case of the coronavirus, of course, in healthcare itself, AI is being used more and more. Have you seen an uptick in Singapore and globally in not only, of course, data analytics, but the usage of artificial intelligence in combating COVID-19?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that both private and public healthcare organizations are realizing is that they haven't digitized fast enough. And we are working with the Ministry of Health of one of the largest countries in Southeast Asia, specifically to build them a data analytics and AI platform so that they can take the data that's coming from the different kinds of contact tracing apps, different kinds of hospitals and labs, and the demographics of the country, taking all this to kind of predict the at-risk locations and the vulnerable areas in the country. And by predicting this, be able to mobilize emergency responses and lockdowns in a more dynamic manner. So we are already working on this. In the US, we're working with a very large healthcare company, network of hospitals that have also wanted to enhance their ability to be more responsive to emergencies such as pandemics, and in general be better in personalized and targeted healthcare. And for them also, we have a strategy and a design for a large scale data lake and the AI models around that. So we are seeing a great deal of interest in healthcare, and it's certainly unfortunate that this is what was needed to get the needle moving, but I think healthcare will never be the same again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Parag, I'm going to do a shameless plug to the great book.
Oh, it's not shameless at all.
as a fellow Hoya, as you know, you were so kind to, of course, sign the copies for us too when we saw each other in Singapore. But with everything that's happened since we saw each other, my God, in November with the coronavirus, again, the challenges, and of course the civil unrest in the United States, but also globally. I mean, is the future still Asian?
Yeah, I mean, I could COVIDify the book in terms of adding this most recent episode and comparing the responses to it. It would fit very nicely in one of the chapters about governance, right? Where we've already covered that base in the last few minutes, in terms of learning how to fuse democracy and technocracy, or democracy and data, to produce better outcomes. And that was one of the arguments that I made there. And as Jim said earlier, it's not in our DNA necessarily to look across the Pacific for lessons in how we can do better, but that's exactly what needs to be done. And that's how good governance is built, by canvassing the world and looking for who has the best experience in taking up certain challenges. But more broadly, let's remember that, and I think this is very relevant to all of the people looking at the future of the world economy. The world has been moving towards a set of regional systems, the North American system. Remember, USMCA was signed in July, this month, a European system and an Asian system. And if you had to pick of the three, and I've been, done a couple hundred webinars in the last few months with a lot of, financial players, and we do these surveys and polls, you're not going to see many people believing that any region other than Asia is going to be the first to recover out of this, right? Because the present is already Asian in that sense. And when you look at the demographics, the urbanization, the embrace of digitization, coming out of the virus, borders will probably open up faster here. The embrace of technology in terms of allowing people to resume that mobility, that stuff's not going to happen as fast in North America or in Europe. So, everything is still pretty much on track, which is not to, smother over the kind of, huge collateral damage, right, that this pandemic has caused. But, people in Asia are willing to tighten the belt and make certain sacrifices in the short term that are needed. Look at the people of Vietnam. This is not a democratic country by any means, but 100 million people and 0 casualties, right? And it's remarkable because the government said, we just have to absolutely lock down. And one of the coolest little anecdotes, but it's a revealing one, it's not that the government disappeared, right? They put vending machines to give out free rice to everyone. You guys may have seen this in the news. So the government is not in retreat, even as they told people, look, we can't, we're not going to be able to write $100 billion stimulus check or more $1 trillion stimulus check, but let's make sure everyone's fed, and please follow the rules and we'll get through this. And lo and behold, Vietnam's back,
But one of the things that you address, not only, of course, in the book, but your recent articles as well, is that, the world shouldn't look at Asia as just being China,
right,
or centric, that there are so many other countries involved, of course, Singapore being one of them, but so many others. Can you kind of expand on that point just a little bit? Because we're going to get into a little bit of US, China, and of course the global economy in a second, but I want to hear your perspective before we do that.
Sure. Well, one of the dimensions of it we've already addressed, which is, I think, the big winners reputationally out of the coronavirus response comparison globally have been Asia's democracies. And we don't tend to think of Asia's democracies as being particularly important other than Japan in a legacy kind of way. But collectively, their ability to, manage the virus has been impressive. And we're finally having a global recognition of this category of states, East Asian democracies. So that alone brings the intellectual conversation quite a bit further than it used to be. And then, of course, these countries are not China, and we've got the geopolitics coming out of coronavirus, in which China has stepped up some of its, assertiveness, and the response to that, I think, has been really strong. On the part of the United States, absolutely backing countries that want to defend their turf, whether it's in the South China Sea, supporting India's position and getting China to back down in their dispute in the Himalayas, and so forth. And so more broadly, there's some of this stuff is pre and post coronavirus, of course, but I think in general there's a coalescence now of Asian states, democratic and otherwise, to try to kind of limit Chinese expansionism now before it becomes a runaway train. And that's kind of a simple way of kind of characterizing where we are. And as much as China's confidence is on display in some of its actions, the growing confidence of every other country to start to coordinate and stand up and balance out that situation is also on display now. And I think that's exactly how geopolitics is meant to operate.
It's interesting. I think that the coronavirus, and there's certainly some positive things that are coming out of this. I hate to say that given the tragedy of this pandemic, but it stripped us all down naked. We're able to determine where we've gone wrong, where we've gone right, and being able to hopefully in some ways reinvent ourselves. To the point that you were making earlier, Ayesha, the notion of that necessity has been the mother of invention, and so artificial intelligence is allowing us to be able to deal with all this. And given the outcome in terms of the global economy, we're finding less expensive ways and safer ways in being able to handle the economy, and that's exactly what's ultimately happening. It's kind of funny, but back here there have been a group of commentators who have been wondering why the casualties have been so low in Asia, and the first thing that came up was, oh, there's something in the Asian body, in the system, that is preventing the coronavirus from affecting them in the same way it's affecting us. And that's such an easy way to just kind of deal with the problem. But I think for a lot of thoughtful Americans, what Asia has done is allowed politics to follow the science, government to be able to follow the science. Here in the United States, I'm afraid that there has been this mixture of putting the two together, one not over the other, and that has created some very serious problems. And so we're dealing with 50 states and the District of Columbia and territories that are going along in their own merry ways, and there has not been a consistent approach that allows us to be able to deal with the underlying causes. Because if we have gone into a lockdown and then decide, oh, it's time to reopen, and we reopen too early, we're going to have to close down again. And that's what's happening in some of these states. And it's making the economy even worse than it would have been if they had just waited a few more weeks. And we understand that because of the examples that we're seeing in places like Asia and even Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very, very true. And the movie is being replayed all the time. In Europe, in Asia, and now it's come to South Asia as well, and to Latin America. And the lessons are quite clear, I think, for everyone, but it's hard politically for various reasons. I mean, in the poorer countries of Asia, unlike East Asia, you see that India and Pakistan, they have not been able to control it at all. And the reason for that is because there's so many people whose livelihood depends on daily wages. They have to go out and earn the money, that the political will is not strong enough to shut down, because that would mean essentially starving these individuals of food, of shelter, of the money they need just to live. So that's why we're seeing those cases skyrocket. It's complicated in different places in the world.
You bet.
For sure. Well, getting into a bit more complicated stuff, Jim, I am going to start with you in this case, please. On the U.S.-China relations, of course, the very complicated relations. I mean, we could do, a series of webinars on these, and frankly, we will be working on those. at the Washington Institute, but there's been some recent developments, of course, on U.S.-China in the news from the U.S. and globally as well. I mean, where are we heading with U.S.-China and especially trade relations, but bilateral relations? And then I want to, of course, hear the view from Singapore as well from our panelists too.
Well, I'm in an interesting position. Many years ago, I literally was the host for one of the very first trade delegations from China ever to come to the United States. It was headed up by the mayor of Shanghai. And it was so long ago that every single person that came in was wearing what we refer to as Mao suits. Nobody had a Western suit on. And those were the days when the United States had a surplus with China. The trade balance was 5 billion exports, 5 billion imports, and the United States, as I say, with an advantage of a few $1 million. And to have watched that trend, I still can remember having watched on television in amazement at the number of bicycles that were all over the streets of Beijing. There wasn't one car. You couldn't see a car. Everybody was on a bicycle. Well, that's not the case today. And so the advancement of China in this relatively short period of time over the past 30, 40 years has truly been extraordinary. But it also has created a certain bullying mentality on the part of China relative to its next door neighbors as well as the rest of the world. It's always been amazing to me, President Trump has developed what he has referred to as an incredibly positive relationship with President Xi of China. And yet the frictions that exist between our countries has been greater than ever. Dealing with what's happening in the South China Sea, which we've just begun to hear from Secretary of State Pompeo, was relatively quiet for a while on the part of the United States, is rather extraordinary. Having done my master's thesis on the UN Law of the Sea Conference, it's pretty clear cut that China is not, quite frankly, abiding to what it adhered to and signed on the dotted line back in the 1970s. And so we've got some real problems, or I should say 1980s, got some real problems both with the approach that China is taking, but also in regards to trade. And that trade has always got to be able to bring in high technology and trying to deal with the fact that, the Washington Institute, for example, is currently the private sector partner to the congressionally chartered U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. And we've gotten heavy into it. It's chaired by a Democrat and a Republican, one from the Senate, one from the House. And we have everybody from the head of the FBI to others who are involved with it. But it's really remarkable to get into the weeds and find out how China and, of course, other countries such as Russia are engaging themselves and trying to get the upper hand in dealing with all this. And the lessons learned from the coronavirus are really stark and unsettling, because if there is an attack on cybersecurity for our people, our businesses, our government, it's going to happen within minutes. It's not going to take a few days or weeks as the coronavirus did. And so we're trying to deal with all these at this particular time. And so China is a real challenge. We are trying, and forgive me for going on here, but we're trying to do our part at the Institute in being able to create a dialogue in people-to-people relationships between China and the United States. And so we're working with the embassy and Shanghai Media Group to be able to produce and ultimately air a piece called My China Story. And it talks about how Americans over time have come to really appreciate and enjoy the company of the Chinese people. And I think if we're ever going to get out of this, there's got to be that sort of what we used to refer to as ping pong diplomacy in being able to form some kind or forge a foundation that will allow us to be able to deal with these other problems that have become so serious and so significant, considering what the implications are for the future.
For sure. Parag, I mean, Singapore is smack in the middle of this. I mean, it's, when we were there with Jim, of course, in November, it was just, we were, of course, in awe with so many things. The city is always moving, right? There's so much happening, whether it's in fintech, it's just one of the hubs, it's a trading center, but it's right in the middle of this frictions between the United States and China. I mean, what needs to happen? What needs to give for this to move along in a direction which will help the world ultimately because of the global economic interdependence?
Well, Southeast Asia in general, doesn't want to get caught up in a new Cold War, right? It's a region that actually has benefited from the rise of China, obviously in terms of trade relations. But a number of countries here, such as Singapore, have very strong relations with the US as well. So there has been this kind of refrain out there that the US and China are carving up Asia into spheres of influence because we like to fall into these Cold War analogies. That's not really what's happening out here, right? Countries are choosing, what I call multi-alignment, right? So gone are the days of picking one side or the other. It's how do you get to have your cake and eat it too? When it comes to allocating contracts, do some business with China, with Japan, most certainly with the US as well. The open, in trade, we call it open regionalism, right? So join the Trans-Pacific Partnership and join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the deal that the US created but didn't join, but also the deal that China is in, right? And trade with India and pursue FTAs with the European Union as well. So we have to get ourselves in the mind frame of thinking of the way in which the middle countries operate as being way more nuanced and complex and intelligent, quite frankly, than in the Cold War, where we were simply trying to paint countries on the map red or blue. And living in one of those countries and studying all of them, gives me actually a high estimation of the diplomatic sophistication of these countries, Singapore being one of them, because I see them playing this game every single day. And actually, they are the ones that are winning, right? They're the ones that are creating the kind of arms race in a way to provide the most investment, transfer the latest technology, do the joint ventures in those countries, and so on and so forth. And that's the way countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and others are actually playing this game. And that's part of why you see the supply chain shifting so rapidly here, why American companies are doubling down, at least pre-coronavirus, in their exposure and in their investments in these countries. Every day you could pick up the newspaper and see a headline that actually shows the contrast between what the foreign policy headlines suggest this new Cold War looks like versus what, say, corporate America and Europe are doing, right? So, to take an example from just the other day, KKR has just closed its latest, very large Asia fund, right? More American tech companies, have been expanding their presence in Singapore and distributing it around Asia. So on and on it goes. Again, the supply chain shifts. So we need to start to think, if you want to think whole of government, and I think obviously it's extremely important part of your mandate, right, to encourage that whole of society, rather thinking, not just whole of government, public, private sector, acting, if not hand in glove, then certainly with a mutual, awareness and reinforcing activities. That's the kind of attitude we need to have to better understand how to play in this region in the future.
Before I turn to Ayesha, there's a question that came in about decoupling, because of course there was a lot of the companies, and you mentioned the businesses too, of course the US Chamber urging China to buy even more US products. But I mean, is decoupling, is that even possible?
Well, in some ways it's already happened. In other ways, it's impossible, right? In the global context of interdependence, in flows of certain, whether it's software, knowledge industry, certain talent flows as well, and various major categories of supply chains, you're not really going to have a global decoupling. Let's remember that Tesla is doubling down in China, right? It's the new Apple in a way. So you've got, and let's remember that it's not really just trade. Finance is, quite frankly, a lot more important than trade. I was simple to explain it to the layman. I always say this: trade is billions and finance is trillions, right? And right now, China is opening its capital account. It's going through this liberalization. The number of banks, American and European, that are gaining those onshore licenses and taking majority ownership of their mainland operations is increasing, right? Now, I know that Congress doesn't want, U.S. pension funds to be, buying into Chinese equities and markets. I know, obviously, we know Congress wants Chinese companies delisted from the stock exchange and so forth. But corporate America and our retirement funds, your IRA, your 401k, has exposure to Chinese equities, right? So there we have that intense interdependence. But in just those straight up trade areas, there is going to be more decoupling, and it's already in some ways baked in. Look, the US trades more with Canada and it trades more with Mexico than it does with China, right? And even if we are just realizing, even if America is now just saying we want to decouple, China wanted to decouple a long time ago, right? The trade war is a result of calling China out on, in some ways, its own attempts to decouple, moving up the value chain, capturing greater market share in key areas, substituting US imports with those from more reliable vendors. And now they're kicking that into overdrive as a result of the trade war and the export bans, export controls on critical technologies. So there's going to be, but the decoupling isn't just sort of, US, China. It's more that Asian countries like Korea substitute for the US in areas where Korea wants to gain market share at US expense. So there's a lot more players in this game than just the US and China.
For sure. Ayesha, I want to ask you, of course, about Singapore and the role of Singapore. You and Parag, you co-wrote a piece on Forbes recently where you talked about Singapore, of course, as the technology and AI hub of Southeast Asia. And then we can broaden that out again, how that impacts, again, the US-China relations, but also the global economy. But before we get into that briefly, if I may, with Ado AI, can you just give us for the people who are watching, for our viewers, what made you create Ado AI? Why did you get into the data analytics and AI side of things? And then maybe you can answer that question, alluding to your Forbes article as well about Singapore and tech.
Absolutely. So I have been in data science and technology since after grad school. I did operations research and then joined Wall Street as a software engineer. And so I was always working on kind of derivatives trading systems, which were high frequency, low latency. And Wall Street always invested in data because it recognized its value in trading, risk management, and wealth management systems. So I worked on a number of those. And when after my PhD, we moved to Singapore, I realized that there was a huge gap in the market, that even though there was more data being generated in Asia through mobile phones, and with the population growth and the economic boom, that there would be data generated from every business, every service, helping companies leapfrog from where they were straight into what I call digitization 2.0, which is data-driven digitization, is what made me start Ado AI. And so that's precisely what we do. We have, 3 of the largest telcos in the world are our clients. 3 of the largest banks in South Asia are our clients. The largest insurance company in Japan is our client. One of the largest taxi companies in the world is our client. Several governments are our clients in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia. And we have some clients in the US. All of them are interested in using artificial intelligence and really data, the gold mine of data, and leveraging that to automate their processes so that they bring the cost of service down and they bring the time of service down, and to innovate, to personalize, to have better results in terms of resource optimization, efficiency of capital, efficiency of human labor, even efficiency of the investments that they make. And Singapore turned out to be the best place to start such a company. There is it's in the air over here because there are so many entrepreneurs, great universities, and the government has systematically encouraged both men, women, students, entrepreneurs from other countries, companies that have moved here from other countries, and those that are here to invest in artificial intelligence. And to all its citizens, it is investing in their startups, it is investing in global startups. It sees that as the driver for the economic engine that Singapore wants to have in the future. So that is why I'm really happy that we're here. even though the economy is not big enough compared to the US and others for a company to grow very big, the Singapore government and all our Singapore companies always think we're global from day one. And I think that's the mentality of a lot of smaller countries, companies from smaller countries. So we go out there, we develop our products here, our services here, our IP is protected here, we find good teammates here, and then our job is to go out there in the rest of the world and engage with other economies and bring value to them.
One of your passions, please, Jim.
You're right. If I may add, one of the things that I've taught in the classroom at Georgetown University is of how precocious Singapore has always been. It started off as a textile economy, and then it decided to get into the electronics business. It also came to conclude, well, we don't have much oil. We don't have any oil, but oil is needed in Asia, and so refineries are needed. Let's start to build some refineries. And it was amazing, but a few years ago, the single largest employer in Singapore was General Electric. Well, to Americans, that was just incredible. And so it seems to me as though Singapore and its leadership and the way that it's developed its economy is always 2 steps ahead. So dealing with big data and technology, getting out of the electronics in terms of putting gadgets together is really amazing. If I were an investor, I'd be looking to see what Singapore is doing, so I would invest in anything Singapore was getting itself involved in. It's extraordinary.
No,
that's a really good point. I think I'd like to add that it's not just the leadership, because I have a charity and we teach students and kids, but there is a great thirst of knowledge and an adaptive spirit of young Singaporeans and even now mid-career Singaporeans who want to learn. And that's really, they are the building blocks. So while the government does some scenario mapping and can foresee the future, I think or good investments to make, what has really always impressed me is that, the students are always interested and curious, and because the universities are good, we're building the human capital that can be paired with artificial intelligence to build the products that we need. So I'm excited about that exposure that I've had to all the great students here.
Wonderful. Parag, I think you had something to add.
Well, yeah, just in terms of, thinking ahead, when people look to the Singapore model today, it's not only what has been built in terms of the infrastructure and industry, but now what they do with their sovereign wealth, right, with 2 very large wealth funds. And to Jim's point, Singapore has now decided to, reallocate or strongly rebalance that capital allocation much more into the Asian region, because it is really sought after as a market maker, a market leader. So what you see now when Temasek and GIC identify opportunities in new technology ventures and companies in Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, that becomes a signal to the major American investors that this must be a good opportunity, a good investment deal, with a positive prospects for high yield and returns, because the Singaporeans do their homework, they go out there, they kick the tires and so forth. And so in that sense also, I think what this small country is doing in terms of its investment portfolio is an immediate transparent signal for those who are kind of holding the levers of Western capital. And I think that is going to be another positive driver of Asianization, because of course, if you're a US or a Canadian or European pension fund, you're looking at massive outstanding liabilities for decades to come in perpetuity, with very little yield in your own markets, right? So, working with, it's important to work with Singapore and in a way follow their lead into the smart investments in Asia that are relatively underpriced and that are going to be high performing, given the demographics and the modernization that's going on here.
Wonderful. Ayesha, I wanted to turn to you again about one of your passions, of course, when you were doing your PhD as well, right? It's been smart cities. So, and Singapore, of course, is in the middle of this. And when we're even in Singapore in November, of course, we're talking about that during the conference as well, about smart cities as well. But of course, there is some criticism, not about Singapore, but in general, that sometimes that model is very difficult to build in larger societies. What's the answer there? I mean, I know you're a firm believer in there, but what do we need to do, and how do we follow the Singapore model or other cities in the world, frankly, that are building the smart cities, because it seems like that's the future.
Absolutely. And I think what Singapore did about 6 years ago was it decided to call itself a smart nation instead of just a smart city, because a smart city had become synonymous with a heavy emphasis on technology over what citizens actually needed. So now it's a much more holistic approach. It's much more citizen centered. And what that means is that it it really is less about the technology. And so it's easier to follow the Singapore model now, because if you wanted to do something in India, you can actually use kind of frugal innovation and come up with solutions to healthcare that may not use the latest technologies like Singapore has, but still are solving the immediate problems that people have by using the mobile phone, for example, more effectively. And I think the thought leadership coming out of Singapore for smart cities is twofold. One, of course, it is that they have systematically invested in technology infrastructure for a long time, which enables them to build upon it. But the two others are this emphasis on citizen-centric smart nation. And what that means is that, for example, if they're building homes for the elderly, they're not only focused on outfitting the home with sensors and with video cameras. Yes, of course, that they do, because a lot of senior citizens have accidents in their home. But they also make sure that they live in environments that are multi-generational and multi-use, because they know that actually the number one cause of senior citizens dying is loneliness and unhappiness also. And they also know that given that we have a graying population here, that it's also because of accidents. And so they are widening the sidewalks, they are making more car light new districts. So what we see is kind of a more interdisciplinary approach to smart cities, which is more focused on the problem rather than starting with the technology. And the second thing is that there's an emphasis on ethics and accountability and privacy. The Singapore government has an ethics and AI committee. Even for self-driving cars, it is very particular. It doesn't start like testing it out there. It has been, the ministers will go and question, what are the regulations? Have you been following these particular things? What are the standards out there? That kind of governance when it comes to technology is very important, so that it's not a kind of wild west, but there's a framework under which these things are thoughtfully and with circumspection kind of carried out. That is the right model. Right now, everybody talks about smart cities. It's in the newspaper. A lot of tech companies are selling it.
Yeah.
But things that you build fast crash fast too.
I love that. That's a great quote. I also want to stay with you, Ayesha, though. So you alluded a little bit to your charity earlier, and of course the work that you do with kids as well. But I think an important component, me as a father of two girls, is also, of course, the empowerment of not only girls, but also women, and in general, and of course, the diversity and inclusion, not only as entrepreneurs, but also in the tech industry as well. You, of course, are an entrepreneur, and you're in tech and in AI. How important is this?
It's incredibly important. If you think about the fact that countries like China have said that AI is a strategic play for them to be more competitive in the global economy, then not having half your population participate in the fact that almost every sector will have a component of data, AI, and technology in it, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage. So first of all, it's just good for the economy. And it's second of all, it's good for products and services. When you have more diversity in your team, whether it's women or minorities, you have less biased products. And this is also very obvious. Almost all of the products we see are usually made for men by men or for women by men. But with the women emerging, getting more educated, especially in the emerging middle class in Asia and around the world, we see that businesses are investing in having women be part of the technology teams as well. And third, I think that it's also very important because it's ethically important not to leave any part of your community and your nation behind. Everybody should get the opportunity. And because of the systematic cultural bias against women in engineering and computer science, we see that women have unfairly sometimes been left behind. So in my charity, there was a young girl, and she said, both her father and her brother discouraged her from taking our AI course, and even said, you won't be good at tech. It's really boys are better. But she did so well in it that the Straits Times covered it, which is a leading newspaper. And her brother and father were so impressed that they even supported her shifting her major from finance to computer science. So sometimes, girls have to unfortunately make that extra effort to prove themselves. And that's why, but we see that when they're given the right environment, they're absolutely as good as the boys. And that always leads to better outcomes for a company, a government, and a society.
Well, I mean, isn't there a common denominator with so many of the countries that have done well, even combating COVID, and have the leadership?
True.
So we should probably look into that as a case study.
It's interesting, but I had, on behalf of the United States, negotiated what turned out to be the last trade and economic agreement with the Soviet Union. And before I went off to Moscow with a team of about 40 people, I sat down with the CIA to be able to gather as much intelligence as I possibly could. And of course, Mikhail Gorbachev, who at the time was the chairman of the Communist Party and in turn the head of the Soviet Union, was obviously taking the country from its central command past and a lack of free expression past and trying to turn it into something very new. But my question was, how has this system continued to work over this entire period? I mean, everything we've talked about as I'm going into these negotiations just shows that this whole thing should have failed. And the response from the intelligence here in the United States was, it's the women that have kept that place alive. It's the women who are out on the farms who are gathering the crops. It's the women in the factories who are really, making a difference. And I sat back and I was amused by it all, because I thought, how could civilization have continued for such a long period of time in which 50% of the population is written off? And that was my first real exposure to the fact that women were a critical component in being able to deal with an economy that was as large as the Soviet Union, which covered at that time 11 time zones. So,
well, Jim, staying on you, I mean, not only, of course, from a female male perspective, but also in general with all that's happening recently in the U.S. with George Floyd, but then beyond, it's become, of course, it is a global issue. The concepts of D&I, diversity and inclusion, are probably more important than ever before. And I know the Washington Institute is, of course, doing quite a bit of work. We're doing a lot of work in this area. Why is it so important to stay on this area?
Well, honestly, our trademarked, and I stress the word trademark slogan is shaping the world together. The fact is that we are getting into a very complicated period in human history. We have just seen what this coronavirus can do. We've seen what civil unrest can do, but we're also, our attention, unfortunately, has been geared most recently to these issues, which they needed to be. But we are experiencing climate change, for example, in incredible ways. Washington, D.C. is about to break records in terms of having been facing 90-degree Fahrenheit weather day after day after day. And I'm afraid that these problems are becoming too complicated for any single segment of humanity to be able to take care of. Not only do we need to acknowledge the fact that business, government, and society have got to work with one another, but countries have got to work with one another. It has been ridiculous that we have had a common enemy in the coronavirus, COVID-19, and yet we all have been going off in different directions. The United States didn't like what the World Health Organization was doing, and so it said, okay, we're gone. We're leaving you. We don't want to be a part of that dialogue anymore with the WHO. This gets to be a bit ridiculous if we don't acknowledge the fact that we've got to be one another's best friends in taking on these challenges we're not going to be able to settle them. We're not going to be able to get them behind us. And I think climate change and the potential for problems in cybersecurity and other, I mean, we're talking here in the United States with the coronavirus that this thing may appear at some point to go away, but it won't have gone away, and that it can come back right back. And if we have not developed vaccines and ways to be able to treat this virus, we are going to be victims. I unfortunately am of a particular age now that I'm told that I'm more susceptible than most people to not only contract it, but to see the dire consequences that come out of it. We've got to be able to join hands and figure out how to be able to deal with these challenges and opportunities for the future.
Parag, I want to turn to you. I mean, with everything that you've written, of course, you've written 6 books, and of course, even I remember when I was, getting my MBA and everything else, we were talking about globalization 4.0 and everything else. I mean, where is the world heading? In my opinion, as a Turkish American, I always look at societies that have been multicultural, diverse, inclusive as the ones that probably are going to be doing well in long term. I know you can't look at the United States with 340 million people and then look at Singapore, which of course is much smaller, and then have one uniform idea. But as far as globalization and society in general, where are we heading? What needs to be done?
A lot of people talk about globalization as if you can just flick a switch and turn it on and off. And as we were saying earlier, there are many examples of the supply chains or critical industries that remain very global, and finance in terms of liquidity in the global system as well. Just let's not forget the resurgent role of the IMF in providing an additional $1 trillion of credit internationally to dozens of countries. But just to point out that, we should not be ideological about globalization as if one is for or against unfettered, laissez-faire, borderless globalization. There are quite a few areas in which that is not desirable. Let's just take energy. It's not exactly good for our planet to pump oil out of the ground in one place and put it on tankers, and the amount of energy consumed and emissions generated in that process, and then sail it around the world to be consumed and burned somewhere else. A chunk of globalization is just that. And we could do well without it, right? The world would be better off without a global market for hydrocarbon energy. Do we have the capacity to do it? The technology, the logistics, the infrastructure, and the markets? Yes, we do. Do we have to use it at the rate of 100 million barrels per day? No, we don't, and we shouldn't. So as countries start to think about how they can have more alternatives and renewables and sustainable energy, they should do it. And therefore you will have a substatistical deglobalization in that area. Great, we should be celebrating it. Other areas though, like let's say data sharing, right? The global knowledge and services economy that to some degree depends on having ever more fiber optic internet cables laid down on the ocean floor. We need a lot more of that globalization, right? A lot less oil pipelines and a lot more data cables, right? So it's really an evolutionary process in terms of which regions are connecting more to which regions, whether it is transportation, energy, or communications, or other forms, but also the flows of people, right? Globalization begins with people moving, across geography, right? And that continues to be something very important. Now, we are in a total lockdown right now, an artificial suppression of this most natural kind of globalization, which is human migration. But it will come back, right? And we are going to see people move again. And they may move in very large numbers, right? And it may be because we have leapfrogged beyond physical passports and basically restricting people's mobility based on their nationality towards more individual characteristics around your ability to demonstrate, your lack of a criminal record or whatever you've got in your bank account, and are you, COVID free? And there could be a microchip, that says all of those things, or that data is on the blockchain, it's been verified. And now rather you as a person, rather than you as a holder of a Turkish passport or a Nigerian passport or a Sudanese passport, you get to go where you're needed. And I'm just going to give you one little anecdote about this, because Brexit stands out to me as the shining example of a country that made a big political decision that, to some degree was premised on a migration related debate. Now, if you just look today, or the last couple of days, at the UK Home Secretary's rolling out the latest, immigration plan, it's like, please, please, please come to the UK. We're desperate. Are you a nurse? Are you a doctor? Are you a student with money? We're desperate to have you right now. Please cut all the lines, get on a plane if you can, swim across the channel if you can make it that far, but we need you. Now, so let's bear in mind how important it is. And needless to say, I think you can see where this is going. Look at our American immigration policy. At a time where you have significant increase in the dependency ratio, aging population, skills mismatches, labor shortages, and so forth, cutting immigration, right? Education being double-digit share of GDP, and freezing students out. This is all going to change, right? We should never extrapolate from the present. When Jim talks about the world becoming more complex, number one lesson in complexity theory is nothing is linear, right? So whatever is happening today is most certainly going to go in a different direction tomorrow. So this is one area where I know we're going to see a lot of change. And that migration wave that's coming, or waves between different points of origin and different destinations, changing because of climate change and which countries are growing and so forth, that's going to be part of that next wave of globalization too. No one's talking about it right now because we've literally never had such an opposite scenario, right? The complete and total freeze of international migration. But like all things, it's gonna bounce back again.
And Ayesha, we can't really do any of this without the role of technology and AI. I mean, Jim always says that. Jim, I'm sorry to take your quote, and it's just that we're so politically, socially divided, but that technology is the thing that unifies us. And he says it much better than I do, by the way. But I'm assuming your view is, of course, that without technology and AI, we can't really move in the directions that Parag was just talking about.
Yes, I mean, I think that technology is actually also a double-edged sword. Just because of the issues that we were talking about earlier, that Jim was talking about, cybersecurity and all that. The more digitally interconnected we are, the more vulnerable we are to manipulation, to fake news, fake images, fake profiles, to cybersecurity, hackers who are using artificial intelligence. We know that the same artificial intelligence models that help you detect breast cancer earlier in women are also the same models that are used to generate fake news. So governance is the key. If you think about AI just galloping without any governance, then actually I don't think it will achieve what we hope it will achieve. But if it is governed properly, and there is, at least in a country, there are the right regulations, and I think then maybe regionally, there is also collaboration on how to use artificial intelligence, then we will see that it can really boost the power of data-driven services, especially basic services that allow people mobility, but also education, healthcare, infrastructure, and transport, and energy, which are the classical pillars of a smart city strategy.
Wonderful. Well, before we wrap up, we just have about 2 more minutes. I do want to ask you about your son and his robot that, of course, he had gone to Barcelona with. How is he doing? Is he developing other robotics as well? I know you're involved with that as well, but how is he doing in this time? Immense challenges, and we're all going crazy with our kids not going to school in the States, at least. How is he doing?
It's definitely a good illustration of how important it is to have a passion project, especially when school is closed. So it's funny you should mention it though, because some of the robotic centers are reopening now. So he's just picking up on, working on the next thing, what he calls Arrow. As you know, Arrow is the name of the original one, ARRO. So he calls it Arrow 4.0. And so, what comes next? And the soccer camp, the soccer team, the Barcelona Junior Academy just reopened yesterday. So he's like a pig in mud. But the next
Happy
thing
pig
is,
in mud.
yeah. But the goal is actually over the summer to build his first flying object. So at one of the maker spaces, he's now working with someone to try and And Ayesha always emphasizes this about the fundamentals. So he's going to learn about flight and physics and mechanics and pitch and tilt and what are the different parts of a plane and helicopter do and how much power and torque, and all this stuff. So, but he will build it himself. This is the thing, step by step by step, week by week by week. And so, it's really fun to watch that unfold.
Well, we're wrapping up now with Jim. Did you have anything else to add before we wrap up?
No, I've enjoyed this enormously over the past hour. I just it does hit me. We've been talking about all these things that are so obvious to us. We all knew that as a result of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, that there would be buyer's remorse in the process. The United States has withdrawn from the World Health Organization. The World Trade Organization is getting hit between the eyes, and it's not being very productive. At the end of the day, these are the only institutions that are going to be able to drive the path on which we need to take. And I think we need to be very conscientious of that. We can talk about all these wonderful things that are as clear as the nose on our face. But if we don't do something, if we don't put these great ideas into action, it is nothing but an academic exercise. And I pray that we can get beyond simply the discussions and get into the let's get it done mode.
Thank you so much, Jim. Ayesha and Parag, thank you so much for staying, of course, late. I know you guys all late. I really appreciated your time with us. Hope to actually see each other in person again soon,
very soon
things normalize. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for having us, Jim.
Thank you.
It certainly felt like we were all in the same place. It was wonderful. Great to see you.
Absolutely. And I can't wait to see you on Fareed Zakaria's program next time.
Yes, for sure.
Looking forward to that too. We'll be in touch. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.